All right. Recording should be going. Yes. And you should be seeing the presentation, right? Some head nods from those of you. Yep. Okay, good. So most of you know why you're here, but if you don't know what this is, you've somehow got the link and you've snuck in. This is the Educause Extended Reality Community Monthly Meeting. If you don't know what that is, you should use this link and go to the community site and join. Terrific conversations, questions posted, answers posted, all sorts of good stuff happening on the community. We're a very active community here. It's wonderful to have all of you contributing to the conversation as we all kind of stumble around in the dark as we figure out how this XR stuff works. Let me just get my. All right, and coming attractions. We do a monthly meeting coming up in December on December 5th. Becky Lane from Cornell, a longtime member of the forum, and Martin Seban from Uptail will be talking about Cornell's use of 360 video. I think mostly in her language area, but anyway, they're doing a fair amount with 360 video. For those of you doing some, this may be a chance to sort of learn from others what they're doing. And for those of you who haven't explored 360 video, it really can be, for the right use cases, it can be a really quick way to get up and running with custom XR content. And so anyhow, that is what we'll be looking at in December. Coming up in January, I'm actually super excited. This is the first, we have not set a date yet, but it will be a Tuesday or Thursday, probably 1 p.m. Eastern time in the early part of the month, hopefully before most of you have started your semesters. They heard mention, I actually forget now where I heard this, but anyway, University of Arizona has started doing this live volumetric capture shared with a group of students. So sort of this live classroom volumetric capture thing sounded really awesome. I want to learn more about what they're doing, and I'm counting on the fact that many of you will too. So more to come on that, but just stay tuned for that. And Sean Hawes and I are putting together the schedule for the rest of the spring. We got a bunch of good ideas with people we were talking to at the annual conference last month. So now I just have to kind of remember what my amazing ideas were that we had in October and start to put that together. But if you have a use case you would like to share and you would like to host one of the meetings, again, informal, really this is all of us just learning from each other. Please reach out to me or Sean and let us know. We'd love to work with you to get your stuff featured. All right. And normally what we try to do during these meetings is meet in VR. If time allows, now I'm counting on the fact that many of you may keep Liz here asking lots of questions, which is good too. But if time allows, we'll jump in and I'll post the link in the chat just before we get there. But we do have a VR space. You can join from it's in frame VR, so you can use your headset or just do it right from your computer. So we'll do that at the end of Liz's portion. And let's see. So this is our speaker today, Liz Shay from the Grants Office. You're all here. You've read the intro. Liz and I worked together on a bunch of projects, 2 years ago. At the time when HP was still doing XR stuff, which they seem to have kind of gotten out of the business of, but that's things come and things go. They actually had a program where they were paying for services with the Grants Office for those of us who were affiliated with this XR program they were doing, to be able to bring faculty members with projects and get advice from Liz and her colleagues at the Grants Office. And it was just, I mean, every one of the conversations we had was just, I was always impressed with how wonderful Liz was, the sources that she was able to find, the recommendations she was able to give as we were going through the process of applying for grants and working with the faculty members. And as we were thinking about topics, I mean, a bunch of you over the last several months have raised the question about, grant sources for XR projects and things like that. In fact, even last week, a question posted to the forum on exactly that topic. So figured this is hot in everybody's mind. Great opportunity for us to hear from Liz and the work she does at the Grants Office. So right before I turn it over to Liz, let me do two things. One is I'm going to stop sharing so Liz can queue up her thing. The other thing is just to help out Liz, if you would please all just kind of sign in the chat. If you put your name, your institution, and your email address, that would be awesome. That information I'm going to share with Liz afterwards, just so she can sort of report to her people as to who was in the presentations and things like that. So please go ahead and just share your info there. And without further ado, Liz, turn the mic over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. As Randy already said, today I'm talking about grant seeking for extended reality initiatives. I am talking about this at a relatively high level, so those of you who are super deep in the grant seeking space, some of it will be review, but hopefully something will be helpful for everyone in today's conversation. Just to start out with, to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about, I'm going to start at a high level and discuss what are grants, how do they work, things like that. And then I will give you a few example grants that can fund XR initiatives. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. As Randy already mentioned, there are a lot of grants that can potentially come into play depending on the kind of project that you're working on. But I'm going to give you an overview of a couple examples, hopefully help you start thinking about some of these kinds of things. I have some tips for grant seeking and then some closing and Q&A. If possible, please hold your questions till the end just so that I can make sure that I stay on reasonable time to keep us all focused today. So just to start out with everything, what are grants? Just in case any of you are not super involved in the grant space, grants are funds that are given by some sort of entity, usually a public body, a charitable foundation, or a specialized grant-making institution, to another entity for a specific purpose linked to public benefit. So something that we hear sometimes is people saying, oh, well, grants are free money. And that's kind of true, but also what they're really doing is grant makers are looking to invest in you to do a specific project that will have a specific kind of outcome. So we tend to think about it as an investment where instead of wanting money back in return, they're looking for some sort of societal benefit in return. So that's what grants are, but where do they come from? So there are three main grants making sources in the United States. The first off, and probably the one that we end up talking about the most, and where I will give my examples from today, is the federal government. There are 26 federal grant-making agencies. They make about $700 billion a year in grants across the public sector and nonprofit space. Obviously, not all of these are relevant to XR, not all of these are relevant to higher education, but they are working across quite a large space, and certainly you could end up playing in a lot of that space. There's also $4.2 trillion from coronavirus response stimulus funding. That is still, some of it is still around. Some of it we know is definitely not around anymore, but it is still kind of a factor in the grant making space. The second source is the state governments. The amount of funding and the types of funding vary quite wildly from state to state, but across the country, they give about $100 billion a year in grant funds to support various initiatives within their borders. A lot of this goes out to other governments, but we also see funding going to K-12, higher ed, healthcare, things like that are also popular topics depending on the specific priorities of any individual state. And then finally, there's foundation funding. So this includes corporate foundations, family foundations, community foundations, all of those kinds of organizations. They make about $70 billion a year in grant funding across the country. They, again, vary quite wildly, in some ways even more so than we see in the public space. The federal government and state governments are subject to lots of rules because they're using tax dollars to do the grant making process. Foundations are using private money, so they get a lot more flexibility in terms of what they can do. They do also tend to have more focused interests for particular communities, particular kinds of projects, things like that. So definitely there can be some opportunities in that space as well, especially if you're working in an area that has a lot of foundations that are interested in supporting projects. Now we have the other part of the equation when it comes to grants, and that's the timeline. So something that you're going to see a lot as we have these conversations is that grants are kind of a long game process. So this is not stuff that's going to be money in hand tomorrow or next week or even next month. This is looking at planting the seeds for what do you want to be doing months down the road so that you can start preparing now, you can start getting the funding now, so that hopefully you can do things in the future. So as I'm having conversations with various institutions and schools and things like that right now, I'm talking about what do you plan to do in fall 2025 or spring 2026 when we're looking at the kinds of activities and the academic calendar timeline. When we're looking at this kind of timeline, the long road there really comes down to a few factors. First, a grant program is typically only announced once per year. There are definitely some exceptions to this. There are some that fund more often. There are some that fund less often, but the most common is they get funded once per year. That particular program, once it announces, typically applicants get 4 to 8 weeks to prepare for an application. I would say something around 45 days is the most common length of time, but it does vary from program to program. At that point, once they have received applications, funders take quite a bit of time to review those applications, score them, make decisions about funding, and that process can take anywhere from 4 to 8 months. Once they've made decisions, there's then an award negotiation process. This is basically where you, as a recipient, and the funder would work through converting your application into a contract that says, I'm going to do these things. You sign some paperwork that says, I swear I'm not going to buy margarita machines with this money, all of that kind of stuff. And that process typically takes about 4 to 8 weeks. And then at that point, you can start actually doing the project. So you can kind of see how this ends up taking a long time, but it's also an opportunity to start thinking forward and starting to make plans for the future so that you can be productive and intentional in your grant seeking efforts. And then the final piece of the puzzle that we need to think about is technology. Obviously, XR is inherently a very technology rich kind of activity. And so when we think about grant seeking for XR, if you just type in grants for XR into Google or whatever, there will be pretty limited options. So what we tend to see is that grant makers very rarely fund a technology for the sake of a technology. Much more often, they're focused on what I like to call the warm, fuzzy feelings. So these are things like student learning outcomes, workforce development, faculty research. You can see on the right side of the screen some examples, things like career readiness, innovative undergraduate education methods, underrepresented student retention and success, things like that. That tends to be what gets the grant makers really excited, and that's what they're focusing their efforts on. That being said, they're happy to fund technology as part of that larger comprehensive project. All of you are here because you care about what the technology is going to do for your students or for other members of your community. So that's the thing to really focus on when you're doing your grant seeking efforts is what is it that you're hoping to accomplish? What do you want to understand? What do you want to be able to do? What do you want to be able to expose your students to? And then think backwards to how does the technology fit into that larger kind of comprehensive project? So typically your applications might include some XR technology, but you will also be including things like staff, maybe some materials and supplies, could be even things like paper and pens, stuff like that. Maybe you need to include some training in that kind of project, whatever that might look like. Those tend to get included all together as components of a comprehensive project budget and a comprehensive project design for an application. So think about what it is, those warm, fuzzy feelings that you get excited about, and that's the stuff to really focus on as you are starting to consider grant seeking for your XR initiatives. So with that, I do want to give you just a few examples and some things to be thinking about as potential places to go. As I said at the beginning, this is definitely not an exhaustive list by any means. I'm just giving you a small taste of a few options and some of the space that they span across in the higher education landscape specifically, so you can just kind of get a taste of what might be out there. So the first of the programs that I want to talk about is the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education, or IU's grant. Just in case anybody's not familiar, STEM is science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But basically, this grant comes out of the National Science Foundation, and it's all about novel approaches to undergraduate STEM education. Its name says it all, really. And there are a couple of goals under this program. One is any approach to STEM education that will increase student engagement and learning. Basically, they want to make sure that students are understanding and retaining the STEM skills and knowledge that they need. And then the other component that can come into play for these projects is organizational change processes across a whole department or institution or community to make systemic changes that will better meet the needs of students. So this might be complete redesigns of curriculum or something along those lines to be able to make sure that students are really understanding the concepts and understanding the material and able to utilize it out in the real world when they get real jobs, all of that kind of stuff. There are a few different versions of this program that can be very helpful to keep in mind. There is a very general version that really works anywhere in the STEM education space, but there are more specific versions for Hispanic serving institutions and two-year institutions focused specifically on those student groups, as well as programs specifically for computing and engineering, because those are big focus areas at the National Science Foundation. Across the board, the thing to think about when you consider these kinds of projects are how is it an innovative process. In this case, you would actually be writing a paper or presenting a poster or something like that at the end to further the STEM education literature. And also, how is it kind of aligning with the needs of your student and their curriculum? So we see things, for example, maybe you want to make a more immersive experience so that students can really be in the process of understanding how molecules work together. Or maybe you want to be working on some sort of interactive opportunity for students to be able to kind of play in spaces that they might not get a lot of practice. So maybe virtual dissections or something along those lines in a biology class. There are a lot of different kinds of opportunities and a lot of different kinds of things to think about, but looking at what kind of curriculum you want to innovate in is obviously the most important part in this particular approach. And then they're happy to fund the XR technology to make that happen. Oops. The next program that I want to talk about is actually Department of Labor grant, and this is the Strengthening Community Colleges Training Grant. As it sounds like, this grant is really about community colleges and led by community colleges, although other institutes of higher education can be partners in these projects. The main goal of this particular program is to increase capacity and responsiveness of community colleges to meet the local and regional labor demands. So there's mandatory and optional collaborations between institutes of higher education with workforce development organizations, with employers, with labor unions, things like that. It's really all about forming those partnerships and making sure that the students are getting exactly the curriculum that they need to be successful in whatever career they're looking to be in. Specifically, the Department of Labor is interested in careers that have high demand and are going to continue to have high demand and also meet what is called good jobs. So these are jobs that have opportunities for career advancement, family sustaining wages, the worker voices involved. All of those kinds of things are really important on any of these projects. These are quite large scale grants. A minimum award size is $1.5 million. So quite large scale initiatives that are going on, but there are also all those partnerships required. So it tends to be large scale initiatives. Typically what we see is a complete redesign of one or more majors within a community college or within a community college system to be able to make sure that students are learning what they need to be able to get hired immediately upon graduating. We see XR kinds of initiatives being used in these kinds of projects all the time. A lot of workforce development focused career pathways, especially in things like infrastructure fields, use a lot of XR to be able to be successful. We see it happening in healthcare, but also in things like vehicle maintenance, especially for things like electric vehicles. We're also seeing a lot of demand for aviation, for broadband infrastructure, areas like that, and being able to redesign the programs to make sure that students are learning things, and any opportunity using something like XR to increase how much students can practice and develop their skills are the kinds of things that get the Department of Labor really excited under this particular program. And then the last grant that I'm just going to briefly touch on today is the Humanities Connections Grant. This is a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And this program is about the interface between a humanities field and a non-humanities field. There are a lot of options in terms of what the non-humanities field is. It could certainly be something in the STEM space, but we also see things like business, health science, law, lots of different areas of interest. And the goal of this program is to develop curriculum, faculty collaboration, experiential learning, those kinds of things across that collaboration. Popular areas of interest are things like ethics of business, or perhaps philosophy being put into an engineering context. Lots of different options, but a lot of times it's about using the kind of humanities ways of thinking and development of skills into another field to be able to deal with their knowledge base and things like that. XR certainly can fit into a lot of these kinds of programs. Certainly, we see a lot of opportunities for being able to involve those collaborations and be able to give students practice, hands-on experience, opportunities to be really immersed in whatever they're learning. Anything that drives the ability of students to understand the concepts is going to be very key for this particular kind of program. This grant is a little bit smaller than some of the others, but it is also still a really good opportunity, particularly if you are working in the humanities space or at that interface between humanities and another field. And it also is really good timing, I think, for things to think about. We're going to talk about the timeline coming up. But we are expecting that next deadline in September. So thinking about things now and starting to plan those collaborations can be extremely beneficial, because it can be kind of a long-term process to make sure you have everything in place. So I know I gave you just a few very quick examples of some specific grants, but some other things to be thinking about and that are trends that we're currently seeing in the grant funding landscape. First off, infrastructure-related fields are very popular and very in demand right now. This is the result of things like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. But across the board, there's a lot of demand for infrastructure-related fields. So if you're working in that space, there's a lot of grant makers who are excited to support those kinds of initiatives. We're also seeing a lot of interest in career pathways. So opportunities for clear on and off ramps between various fields into various kinds of careers, and on and off ramps in the educational space. So if you're collaborating with K-12 or collaborating with workforce development organizations or any of those kinds of entities to be able to develop something that allows for things like short-term credentialing or dual enrollment opportunities, things like that. That's another thing that grant makers are very excited about right now. And then finally, wraparound services. So right now, grant makers are realizing that students are not operating in a vacuum and that they have other things going on in their lives beyond their classroom efforts. And so there's a lot of interest in including wraparound services in other kinds of projects, especially in workforce development focused kinds of projects. So thinking about things like childcare, violence prevention programs, transportation, food, etc. While those might not be as XR focused specifically, when you think about that comprehensive project, take that broader scope into account as you're thinking about what you might want to be doing, and consider some of those other factors that might come into play when you're looking to support your students in making them be successful. So with that, I know still pretty fast on these kinds of topics, but the last topic I want to cover today is just a few tips to start thinking about as you're pursuing the grant seeking journey. And these are tips that apply not to a specific grant so much as things that you can prepare now and conversations that you can start having now to be able to prepare for any of your grant seeking efforts, so that you can be really intentional about what you're doing, because that kind of intentional process does increase your chances of success when you go to submit something. So first off, This is a really good opportunity for you to start brainstorming things that you might want to do in the XR space and start answering those 5 W's to understand what it is you really want to do. Once you understand what you want to do, it becomes a lot easier to start finding the best grant opportunities that will help support those initiatives. So first, think about who your project is for. So what is that target population? What are their needs? Are they having particular wraparound services kinds of concerns? Do they come from a particular cultural background that might have certain relevance in the kinds of examples or kind of programming you want to give? Whatever that might look like, think about who that target population is and make sure that you understand them very well. You also want to consider what outcomes or benefits will occur. This is one of the most important things. I talked a lot about those warm, fuzzy feelings. What are the student learning outcomes, workforce development, research, whatever that might look like? What are those goals and what are those benefits? Because that's the thing that gets the grant maker excited. And at the end of the day, that's the thing that's going to make them decide they want to fund you. Then think about when you plan to accomplish your project. Determine your timeline for implementation. Work backwards to get to a realistic grant timeline. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple more slides, but start thinking about when you ideally want to do something and know that that might be a factor in what kinds of grant opportunities you consider. Something like a foundation might move a little bit faster than a state or federal funder. On the flip side, a foundation might be a smaller funding bucket, so you do have to kind of deal with that interplay between the two. Then think about where your project is going to be implemented. Think about partnerships. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. But think about partnerships you might need to have or other kinds of factors that might come into play based on the location and what you're looking to implement. And then also think about why you want to do this project. Create those SMART goals, which we're going to talk about coming up, but also figure out what your outcomes are and figure out how they have societal benefit for your project. Beyond just your students or your target population, what is that broader impact? That's the NSF word for it, but it does happen elsewhere. What is that bigger impact that you're looking to have on society? And how can whatever you plan to do really teach others about possibilities? I know Randy talked about some upcoming projects where people are going to share some of their things and the successes that they're having. Think about that kind of context. What would you be able to contribute to this group or to other groups to be able to really be successful in a broader space? So I mentioned SMART goals coming up, and you might have heard about these. I feel like they're a very popular topic to be talking about right now. But every goal that you set, you want to make sure that you put in these 5 components to make sure that you're really putting together something that can be successful. So first off, you want to be very specific about what you're trying to do. So you need to think about what you're going to do, why it's important, who needs to be involved, where it's going to take place. The more details you can give with the goal, the more well thought out your project is, and therefore the more a grant maker is going to get excited about funding it because they know that you can be successful. You also want to make any goal measurable. So how do you measure that progress and how do you know when a goal is achieved? Typically what this means is you need to be able to put a number to anything that you're doing. There are a few exceptions, but generally you're looking to put some sort of number. So for example, you might want to say, we were going to, by the end of our 3 years, have 50 students who've taken place in whatever course you're developing or something like that. You want to make sure it's actionable. So what are those actions or activities that will work you towards your goal? What resources do you need? Are these actions within your control? That's one of the most important features. If it's beyond your control, it's not a very good goal because you kind of can't make sure that it actually happens. So make sure that anything that you're trying to do is within your control. Make sure it's realistic. So is it realistic given the time frame that you have, the resources you have? If you're doing a project that is a small scale kind of pilot project, you probably don't want to be saying you're going to have 5,000 students coming through or something along those lines. Or if your whole degree program only has 100 students in it, you should definitely not expect all 100 of them will be finishing something. Also think about time bound. Are there smaller deadlines or checkpoints that you should be coming into, especially if you're looking at doing a multi-year or larger scale project? Having those smaller deadlines is very helpful. And then also, what's your final deadline? So maybe over the course of a 3-year project or a 2-year project, whatever that might look like. Take all of those things into account as you're developing your goals and as you're thinking about your project components. And a lot of these things are going to then interplay to the activities that you plan to do, the stuff that needs to show up in your budget, the people that are going to show up in your project. All of those things are going to come back into play as you define your SMART goals, and you can kind of then work backwards from there. Another of the topics that I said we were going to touch on is partnerships. So there are many reasons that you might want to pursue partnerships, things like adding expertise, making a well-rounded project, working towards mutual goals. But there's also instances in which you might want to pursue a particular grant and partnership is mandatory. There's a reason for that. Grant makers think that the expertise of multiple organizations is necessary for a successful project. But developing effective partnerships even before you pick a grant is super beneficial. So think about what you're bringing to the table, but also what it is that you might need to be able to develop a successful project. So whether that is contractor expertise, which might be a factor in some of these kinds of projects, or whether that's somebody internal or external to your organization who can provide additional assistance. So if you really specialize in the XR space, maybe you need a subject matter expert in a particular field as you're considering a particular kind of project to support, say, a chemistry class or something like that. You may also need external partners, so maybe employers, to let you understand what exactly they're looking for in new graduates to be able to hire them. You may also need collaboration with K-12 to be able to really develop a comprehensive pipeline of success across the board. Think about who might have that expertise and start having conversations with them very early. Start with something casual and just get to know them and get to know what they and their organization is looking to do. And then you can work to formalize a partnership as you all figure out that you are working towards those same goals and you're able to work towards a more intentional, comprehensive project that you actually want to write up as a grant application or something along those lines. And then the last main component of things that you're going to need is some high-level stuff that every project is going to need. A lot of these pieces, if you're at a university or a college, it might come from your Office of Sponsored Programs or your college foundation or something like that. They might be involved in a lot of these things, and they might even put some of these pieces together for you in the submission process. However, it's still good to know about these kinds of components and know that these are things that are going to be a factor. And being able to put some of these pieces together ahead of time can be super beneficial to being successful. And then I mentioned that like potentially 45-day application window. Having some of their stuff together ahead of time can really help with that process. So these are things like your organizational records, your mission statement, strategic plan, bios of individual people, things like that. You'll also want your account registrations, whether that's tax ID, your EIN, grants.gov login, etc. You'll also want your grant policies and procedures. This is one of those things that tends to come from the institution itself, but what are your grant seeking and grant management practices? What are those rules? Do they need information 2 weeks before a submission or something like that? Understanding that timeline is really key to being able to be intentional in your grant seeking. If you find something that only has a 30-day window and they need things, 15 or 20 days ahead, that starts to get very tight on timeline. So making sure that you understand what that process looks like can be very beneficial to making sure you're prepared for an application cycle. You're also going to want an evaluation of your impact. What are the outcomes for students and for your community on particular projects that you've been successful on in the past? And then also think about your current and potential partners and collaborators. This is both your internal partners, whether at your department or in another department, and also potential external collaborators at other organizations that might be working on projects with you. Know who they are ahead of time and have those conversations on a regular basis so you're not scrambling when you start to prepare a particular project. And then I just want to talk very briefly last about an ideal timeline for preparing for a grant. We talked about how a grant is only open for 4 to 8 weeks. So we're looking at average of 45 days or so for a grant application to be open. And that's a very tight timeline when you start to prepare all the pieces. And it's an even tighter timeline if you haven't already thought about what your projects should look like. So hopefully you've taken that brainstorming slide by the time you're getting ready to apply for a grant, and you've started to prepare your project and think through your SMART goals and all of those kinds of things. But now is an opportunity in an ideal world, if you've identified a grant, to work yourself backwards from a projected deadline to be able to start planning now. So for example, we talked about how Humanities Connections is likely to be due at the start of September. You can work your way backwards to get to when you should start preparing. In an ideal world, you would start 9 months ahead of time to start forming those collaborations, and then you'll spend some time assessing your project-specific needs, gathering data, finalizing your data, finalizing partnership roles, all of that kind of stuff. About 6 months before a deadline, you really want to have identified that as a grant of particular interest for you to apply for. Again, this is an ideal timeline, so it doesn't always work this way, but it does work the best if you've identified those specific grants pretty well ahead of time. You then think about designing your program with the targeted grant or grants in mind. So refining what you want to do or considering a piece of your larger project that fits within the particular interest of that grant program. About 4 months before, you should figure out your cost estimate and know exactly how much everything is going to cost. At 3 months before, you develop the narrative and collect information for the various attachments that tend to go into any grant application. 2 months beforehand, you'll finalize your budget and collect letters of support. 1 month beforehand, you will be finalizing all those application components, and then you will be ready to submit by deadline day, if not before. Again, this is an idealized version, but hopefully it can help with setting up some processes internally as you're thinking about grant seeking and being able to set up a calendar and say, okay, we know these are the expected deadlines, so start working backwards from when we want to start preparing various components, even if a solicitation has not been released yet. They stay pretty similar from year to year, so being able to start preparing things even before the guidance releases can be very beneficial to making sure that you are not going crazy and working really long days right up to an application window. And so with that, I'm going to give my one little like sales pitchy slide. So Grants Office is a company. We do this, as Randy mentioned, this is our job. So that means we have to get paid sometimes. So we help out with things like awareness of grant funding opportunities, identification and development of grant-ready projects, making informed planning and strategy decisions, and development of competitive proposals. We help across that entire pre-award space. So if it is something of interest to you, you can get in touch with us at the email address that's on the screen, info@grantsoffice.com. And with that, I'm done my whole sales pitchy bit. And what questions does anyone have?
That's fantastic. Thank you. One quick note, for those of you, if you've come late or haven't caught the note, if you haven't put your name, email, and institution in the chat, please do. We're asking everybody to sign in just so we have a list so we can share with Liz afterwards. I think, Liz, one of the points, you talked about this sort of wraparound services with some of these things. We've got a lot of technologists here. We tend to love the technology. And so I like your focus on the outcomes, the audiences served. They're actually an example I use all the time at Yale. We have faculty with School of Medicine in Cancer Center. They are using virtual reality meeting space to do virtual counseling sessions for teenagers who are undergoing cancer treatments. Super simple. There's really not much technology involved, but super impactful. I mean, a very important connection with a very, needy group. Their experience was that the teenagers wouldn't come into New Haven to go to the in-person counseling sessions. They know that the patients benefit enormously when they can participate. They started doing it in VR. They provided headsets to the students. They had, there's a lot of really good things that they were able to fund through the program. But in the end, the outcomes were amazing because the teenagers participated and they got the benefits where they weren't before. So very simple from a technology standpoint, but big outcomes, right? And that's the sort of thing I think you were sort of aiming for there.
Yeah, exactly. I think anytime that you can lower the barrier to participation, that can be a really big factor for a lot of people, whether that's in education or whether that's in something like counseling. That lowering the barrier and making it so that fewer things in their life can block their ability to participate, the more likely they are to be successful. And I think grant makers are realizing that that's the case. We're not just in higher ed, it's not just a bunch of 18-year-olds who live on campus and never do anything else anymore. That's not what school looks like. So think about that bigger picture that they're working within.
Yeah, yeah, like virtual reality wellness sessions and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of interesting opportunities that people are starting to go with. So please unmute yourselves, turn on your video. If you've got a question, raise your hand. And Sean, you're first.
Yeah, Liz, thank you. That was super helpful, and thank you for letting us record this as well. So even participants of the community group who are not here right now, I'm sure will benefit from this. One question I have, given the nature of, I think pretty much everyone on this call right now is from a different institution. What guidance do you have for kind of multi-institution grant proposals in terms of strengths, challenges? Any particular type of grant, like federal grant versus private benefactor, et cetera. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so I would say in probably these kinds of collaborations are most common in the federal space, although we certainly see them happening in the state and foundation kinds of spaces as well. I would say the benefits and challenges sometimes are the same. So the more voices you have and the more expertise you have, the better it is. On the flip side, now you have more voices and more expertise that can sometimes make it harder to make sure that you're really focused and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. One thing that I think can be very important when considering multi-institution collaborations, which certainly grant makers love, they love to see that you're really thinking comprehensively, particularly between institutions of a similar region, to be able to say we're really thinking about what's going on in our area quite broadly. You need to figure out who is going to be in charge. Who is the lead institution? Who is going to be the major fiscal responsibility kind of institution? This is typically the one who is most experienced with grants and the most well situated to handle the paperwork side of things. And then with that, they can kind of help coordinate the rest of the organizations. Everybody should make sure that they have one or more representatives at the table. If an organization like a school is not at all involved in the discussions, they probably are not going to be successful in the project. So make sure everybody's at the table throughout the entire planning and execution process. And then make sure that you develop, if this is true with any kind of collaboration, what's called a memorandum of understanding. So this is basically a legal document, but it's a document where you write out what each organization is and what they are responsible for the project. Leadership signs off to make sure that you have shown that you're really committed to the project. Sometimes this is mandatory to share with a grant application, but even when it's not, setting up this kind of document is really key because otherwise it can be very difficult to say who is doing what and things start falling through the cracks and stuff doesn't happen. And so making sure that you're very explicit through the process about exactly what everybody is contributing, that's what's going to be most successful.
Thank you so much. And one quick follow-up question, recognizing that here on the call and part of our wider community group, we have colleagues from all over the world, places beyond the 50 United States and obviously the federal government reach of the US. Any insight on international collaborations with either of those or any of those three categories that you spoke about?
Yeah, so international collaborations are tricky when using public funds because, as I mentioned, they're tax dollars, so then that can sometimes make it complicated. There are cases in which it's possible because you're able to demonstrate that the international organizations are the only ones with the appropriate expertise. So that's a real key there. If you're looking more in the foundation space, they can be a little more flexible. It's private monies, so they're a little less rules driven about it all has to happen inside a particular country. But the same thing still really applies. It's being open with the communication, being clear about what everybody is contributing, and then considering the leadership organization, the additional factor being, are they located in a place that is easily compatible with the grant maker? Because that will make all of the paperwork a lot easier.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Chris?
Hi, thanks, Liz. I really appreciate this perspective. I have a couple questions. One of them is on the NEH Humanities Connections slide. There was a note there about long-term institutional support, and is that about you need to demonstrate that, or you might be able to get it?
Yeah, so this is more demonstrating it. So something that happens kind of across the grant making space, and I would say particularly in the federal space, is that they're looking to fund what's next. They don't necessarily want to fund exactly what you're already doing. They want to fund how you're pushing the envelope. So something like Humanities Connections in particular, they're really looking at the development of that interface between multiple disciplines. And then they want to know that the institution is going to continue to support that effort beyond the end of the grant period. So maybe it becomes a mandatory course or an elective within one or more majors. Maybe it's somehow otherwise supported, but the intention is that it's not going to disappear at the end of the project period, never to be heard from again. This is something that the institution actually wants and is hoping to accomplish, but needs the money to get it going.
Okay, darn. I assumed that was the case, but this is
It would be
often
really nice if they were just like, I will fund you forever, but
no,
no
and
such
this
luck
is,
there.
yeah, especially for humanities and digital humanities projects. This is often the very difficult thing that we see with our academic projects. Yeah, very much a challenge. The other question I had is I'm on one of our human subjects committees at UC Berkeley, and we've seen a couple of XR proposals coming through human subjects. And one of the challenges has been like if sometimes they're using kind of an outside service provider or software where there's questions about the data and the data privacy and kind of human subjects issues. What do you have any kind of advice or observations of what you're seeing from a grants perspective?
Yeah, so I will be honest, I don't spend a ton of time in that space anymore since that tends to come post award. And I tend to stop helping at when you hit submit, not because I don't like everybody and want to help you, but that's just not my expertise. I am a former researcher, so I did deal with human subjects. I can tell you all about all my human subjects training back when I was a researcher doing that. But something that we do tend to see is that is a huge concern. Data privacy is always a concern. And so I would say my advice in general is to have those conversations with your third party contractors before you even start a project. So as you're starting to think about what kinds of services am I going to use, who am I going to contract with, what kinds of things am I hoping to accomplish, it's never a fun question to ask to be like, what does your cybersecurity look like and what are you doing with my data? But it's super important to have that conversation very early so that you don't kind of get boxed into a corner in which it's not possible to do your project because it can't be met in that kind of space.
Thank you.
Super. Chris, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. And I'll throw one in if nobody else is going to speak up. Hey, so Liz, where do you see the opportunities with industry funding? And I'm thinking now something like the HP grant I spoke about, but Meta has funded some educational projects, Unity has funded some. I mean, so there's been some of these floating around. Any words of advice on that industry connection?
Yeah, so I would say in that space, ultimately what the industry cares about is being able to use your project as a use case example and as kind of like a PR kind of moment. For better or for worse, that's their ultimate goal, right? And so I think anytime you want to work with them, think about what they get out of this. So, what are you doing that's unique and pushes the envelope in the kinds of space that they're interested in? And they're much more likely to fund you than if you say, oh, I just don't have the money for something or whatever that might look like. Think about what they can get out of it. So, what are you doing to working with a different student population than they've seen or a different kind of application of using their technology than has been seen? That's the kind of stuff that tends to get them the most excited.
Great, thank you. All
Yeah,
right, so I
absolutely.
stole the last question, but I'll open it up. Any one last question? All right, great. Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much. Virtual, the room would be applauding wildly if we were all in the same room, but everybody is here. This has been recorded. I will share afterwards so people have access to the slides. Liz, if you want to go ahead and just throw your that info at the Grants Office email in chat, just so we have it as part of the official stream.
Yep, I just dropped it in there. You can reach out to helpdesk@grantsoffice.com with miscellaneous questions. Also, if you ask there about what we do, that's totally fine. We're not worried. We're all human people looking at these emails.
Super. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was
Absolutely.
fantastic. Coming up December 5th, please keep your eyes out for, I'll post more on that. I'm starting to use the events feature of our community forum, which is supposed to send meeting invites out to all of you. If you don't get, but you want to get it on your calendar, go to the forum, go under the events tab. You'll see the events listed, and there is a add to my calendar link there so you can get it on your calendar so you won't forget. Stay tuned for January and more stuff coming in the spring. I've already got January figured out. So Sean's taking care of February, March, and April, and he's got it all nailed down.
Yes, of course.
For those of you who want to meet in VR, I will share this link real quick. I'm going to jump in there. This is courtesy of the Immersive Learning Research Network. Jonathan Richter, I noticed. Jonathan, I noticed you were on the call. So there is the link if you want to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording and see you all next.